We're going to start shortly for now, so it brings so closer the grades. It's just a very common side. So welcome to Suhba and Heritage Storytelling Abroad. Our guest speaker is Japanese Russell. If you don't know him, Japanese University. I'm sure everybody here knows Rutgers and strong so you know him. So I'm grateful enough to take the time out of his schedule to be with us for the next 3 sessions. So today, August 24th and September 7th. And so not losing more time, so Japanese.
جزاك الله خيرا. بسم الله الحمد لله والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى بسنة الله سبحانه وتعالى صلى الله عليه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. I know it's Asr time, we're a little bit close, and it's really quite warm in here. The warmth of your company, inshallah, should be reflected as a result of the heat here. But alhamdulillah, it's an honor to be here with all of you. It's an honor to be here in an initiative called Suhba, for companionship. So we're going to inshallah keep the spirit of Suhba alive in that I will be interacting with you as we start exploring today the idea of inheriting storytelling. As Ishan had told me about kind of the group and its mission, I thought a lost art in our tradition is actually the art of storytelling. And the art of kind of really appreciating how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells stories, and as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us stories, what we can really pick up on in terms of our ability to understand our own stories and our ability to draw inspiration, lessons, motivation, and warnings from the stories that we hear, not just the ones from the Quran, but also the ones that we see in our daily lives. So I want to go through the brief time that we have. I know Maghrib is coming up in the hour, and I'll finish before Maghrib. Is really understanding first and foremost, when talking about stories in the Quran, most of the time we think about them as like bedtime Quran stories. I actually really Googled stories in the Quran, looking for a cool. And I looked at it on many different search engines, and all I could find was children's books. And I realized that's actually part and parcel of the problem. That when we think about stories of the Quran, the average age that we are is, I don't know, someone tell me, what is the first time you heard the story of Musa? Age of 6, like the age of my daughter, which scares me a lot, that's when the story of Musa was told. When was the last time we were presented in its entirety? For me, I remember it was 6th grade. I was probably 11 years old, 10 or 11 years old. And that was the last time we went literally from the beginning to the end, and there was a Sunday school. And we went through the story of Musa. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but I'm also saying that this is a story that's mentioned in the Quran in almost 80 different places. And the way we tell it is at the level of an 11-year-old. We leave it. Even to the point where I remember I was referencing the story of Moses from a Quranic perspective in my undergrad in college in my biblical studies class. And I started thinking, this isn't how our story goes. And I looked back, when was the last time I actually went through this? Oh yeah, when I was 11 years old. We leave storytelling. This isn't just something that's a problem with our approach to the idea of stories in the Quran, but so many aspects of our tradition. We leave them to the youngest component. The first time we heard it is the last time we actually looked at it. And this is a bigger problem, and not the focus of today's just quick understanding of storytelling of the Quran. But sometimes we wonder why Muslims fall off. Why do they stop practicing once they reach college, once they get married, once they insert whatever life milestone they want to, once they take a philosophy class. And part of the reason that that happens is if the last time a level of education was systematically formulated was at the 5th, 6th grade level, a 5th grade textbook is always going to lose to a college textbook. It doesn't matter how well it was written, the audience, the way it was put together, it was meant to fail at that point because we outgrow almost anything that we learn when we're My daughter right now, told me she's 6 years old, when she ties her shoelaces, she talks about the story of the rabbit going underground and then grabbing its ear and pulling it so that its ears are just sticking out. That's how she ties her shoelaces. I don't think, inshallah, when she's at your stage, that she's going to continue with that story. Why? Because, like, really going to hope that she doesn't need a story to tell her how to tie her shoelaces properly. Because she's expected to outgrow it. Some of you have, on campus, heard me use this story before. We do this to almost every single facet of our lives. When we think about your understanding of economics, I've shared this story a couple of times. I remember a couple of years ago, I went with my nephew, who at that time was about 6 or 7 years old. It seems to be a very significant age for me. But I took him to a mall, and we had went down during the day, and he wanted to buy this really cool trade set. And I had spent the amount of money that I could that day. And he looks at me and goes, "Look at that machine over there, it prints money." And he pointed to the ATM. And I looked at him in that moment and I was like, "You're not wrong, but you're also so not right with the statement." Because for him, the understanding of where does money come from? That box. You put your card in and money comes out. I wasn't about to explain to him how career choices work. That I may not have the ability, but someone else might have to buy him the trade set that he wanted that day. But I'm expected to do that. If I was out one of you, and one of you pointed to an ATM, if I told you, like, having financial difficulty, I'd want to smack one of you up, being like, where did the education system fail you? But you don't really understand what I'm saying. But to be fair, that's actually what I'm alluding to when I say this is what happens when we see things like the story from the Quran. The last time we talked about them was when we were in like 5th or 6th grade. We were expected to actually raise our level of understanding, raise our vocabulary with which we're supposed to be talking about them, or else they're going to start seeming irrelevant. Not because there is relevance in them, but because we didn't actually level up our understanding or our ability to talk about them. And the attempt that I'm going to do over the next couple of weeks, inshallah, is talk about storytelling in the Quran and raise our level of literacy about stories in the Quran, both from a contextual perspective, in terms of, we'll actually go through certain stories in the Quran, talk about maybe look at them from a light that we haven't seen before, but also from just appreciating why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trying to capture timeless wisdom, guidance for all of humanity from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam up until the day of judgment. Over a third of that guidance is going to different stories. Why would that be the case? To really try to appreciate and understand So that as we read the stories of the Quran, we have more of a further appreciation of them and how to grow a lesson. And on the other side, you're going to see stories that are derived from the stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us and derive guidance from them as well. So, with that, I'm going to first ask the question to all of you. Why do you think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells stories? And I meant it like this distinguished. So that we can remember them better. That's a very, very good point because just the way human minds work, we remember narratives way more than we remember just random facts or lessons or morals. A story, it hits home, so you can remember it more, maybe you can relate to it, the characters that are found so good, so you can remember them more. A very solid reason. What else?
Same thing, contextualize, make things relatable. And you can have rules and laws, but sometimes some of them make sense once you have context behind it, or how to apply it. And like you said, it's more digestible.
Exactly. If I was ever trying to teach like principles of a successful CEO, I could just list a bunch of successful habits that someone does, but what would we more probably benefit from is give me an example of someone who's done this well. Who maybe you don't even just give the habits that he has, you give like, where did he get those habits from? Was it because he was born in a household that had a lot of discipline? Was it because he had a health condition? Was it because of this? Because of this that led to him having these successful habits? We tend to relate to that. It's like, oh, just like they're going through struggles, I can go through struggles. And so yes, to become more relatable, to remember it more. Okay, good. What other reasons could it be? That's a really good point as well. And that is that these are stories that people were familiar with already, but maybe they weren't utilizing them properly is one way, or if I'm going to be much more direct, to correct how they do these stories. So that's one of the major things that the Quran does, and I'm glad you brought that up, because when we talk about Quranic storytelling from more age-appropriate setting, the Quran actually skips out a lot of details because it expects you and me to look at how other people have told these stories and see how Allah tells them is different. And in that difference, there's even more lessons. So yes, to correct the narrative of certain stories, to correct the way you view certain stories, that's one of why that Allah tells stories. That's very true as well. Anyone else? I've got answers from this side of the room, even though numerically there are more people on this side. Yes. Connection, could you elaborate? That's very true. So it's connected to the idea of being like relatable, but connection I think goes a little bit deeper. That you're able to connect and you're invested more in the story. And I'm going to say something which some of you might find controversial in the beginning, but part of what a story does is entertains, doesn't it? Like a story entertains you, it keeps your attention locked in. That's actually one of the purposes that stories are told. And where, I promise you, I'll give you the lead for this. There's a narration of the Prophet captured in the Shama'il of the Prophets, the Shama'il which is a bunch of narrations about who the Messenger was. And one of the chapters is the Prophet gathered his entire family together, and he told them all about what's his name? He told them all about this random Arab night. And he went through literally 3 or 4 hours of just talking about a person who never really existed, a fictional character. The Prophet never did anything except that there was guidance within it, and that it led to guidance at the end of it. It was pure entertainment for them to go through. We can say one of them is actually for us to be more invested and entertained. That's okay. You're allowed to be entertained by the Quran. That's actually one of the why you feel more connected to it. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Anyone else? Yes. It's easier to take, and it's easier to take lessons from stories because there's an experience found within it. And that's actually the answer that I'm going to build on a little bit when I provide a de facto answer. But one of my personal opinions as to why stories tend to be the best vector to actually pass on lessons is because when you hear about the experiences of other people, your own experiences actually become better. And how I'm going to do that is, I know this sounds like a college lecture, my apologies, but by making us first appreciate a little bit about what is an archetype. And I'm going to be drawing from a specific discipline of psychology known as the psychoanalytical approach that was coined or really developed by Carl Jung. And for those of you who don't want a Psych 101 lecture, this won't be a Psych 101 lecture, but there are two major disciplines within psychology. There's Freud and then there's Jung. This is the Jungian approach rather than the Freudian approach, even though there's a lot more parallels than there are contrasts. But anyway, what I mean by this is he had an interesting theory in which he said that all human beings have archetypes. They have small parts of their psyche that are locked away into measurable and locked away into distinct places. And you make the analogy, it's kind of like the human body. Like any of us would say my body, but then if you wanted to separate your body out, I have a heart, I have a liver, I have lungs. And he goes as far as to take that analogy to say that someone can go their entire life without thinking that they have a heart. There's a joke in there somewhere. Okay, they could go their entire life without thinking that they have a heart. But once their heart starts giving them problems, it would really move them to understand, I need to really take care of my heart. Following me? Someone can go their entire life without thinking they have a liver until they have a liver problem, and they're like, oh, so this is what our liver is supposed to be. Carl Jung made the argument that all human beings actually, in their own personality, have these things called archetypes, which are doing that as well. And we'll go over what the major archetypes are. There's different theories. People have written a bunch of different theses on how to really understand this. But you have these different parts of yourself that you constantly are bringing with you. So most of the time you're not aware of them. But if one of them is out of balance, you're suddenly going to start living a dysfunctional life, just like in your body. You might be going around normally, and then suddenly what happens? If you have an enlarged liver, I don't know what's I'm not going to try to say that. Liveritis. Inflammation of the liver. I think says that. Suddenly you're going to be like, okay, how do we take care of this? He says the same thing actually happens with human beings. And almost anything that leads to a non-competent human life is an imbalance of working archetypes. And he said sometimes it's divided into 16 archetypes. I'll return to this not today, maybe next time we're together. I personally, I'm writing a book right now called Archetypes 101. There's 37 archetypes that I found in the book so far. Well, a lot of them there actually are, but there's generally a good one of 16 human archetypes. But they all fall under 4 major archetypes. And those 4 major archetypes are the ego, the self, the animus, and the shadow. And the idea here, what is essentially with storytelling, is a story makes you more aware of your own personal archetypes. And what I mean by that is, as you read the stories in the Quran, all the answers you guys gave are perfect. They're actually part of the purpose of why often reveal stories. But one of them is you actually understand yourself more. Because in the stories of the Quran are actually the story of each of us. When you see the struggles that Maryam alayhi salam has in being given the role of motherhood, you actually start appreciating, sometimes the task is given to me that I don't feel quite ready for. Process that more. When you mess up, and you know you messed up, but you don't know what to do next, when you read the story of Adam and Salam, it allows you to process that more holistically. But I'm jumping ahead and first define what these 4 major archetypes are. But that's kind of what I'm presenting as today. There was a thesis of today. The Quran stories in the Quran help you to understand yourself more. that it's a curriculum from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That as you read these, you'll know you. Because who's giving you these stories? What created. That's what the purpose of stories in the Quran are. And storytelling in the Quran does so in a way that really hits home and allows us to develop as individuals and as a society, and we'll understand that more with each way. But the four major archetypes, the simple archetypes, are first and foremost the ego. And I know most of us see the ego as this like bad thing. For the most part, it is usually negative, especially when we're talking about it in a Freudian sense. But the ego is an individual who you are in the given moment. Meaning, when you look in the mirror, who stares at your back? Those images are not really correlated. I'm just talking about but it's as who you are in the different situations that you find yourself. So an ego will be a collective of who I am at school, who I am at home, who I am at work. When I combine all of those together, that will be ego, that will be who I am at that moment. Those of you thinking the Marvel villain, you're kind of on right now. So that's the ego. It presents itself as the other person wants it to be seen. It's who you present yourself or portray yourself as. That's the ego. The next one is sometimes called the collective ego or the collective self. This is the goal of what the ego is trying to reach, whether it realizes it or not. In classical literature, this was usually at the very end of the story where you want the protagonist to end up. In other stories, this is often it's more spiritual in nature. This is represented by God. This idea that what you're eventually trying to get to, what is your destination, that's the collective self. When the ego finally finds its purpose or makes peace with everything, it's able to perceive the collective self. And typically, in religious context, it was called, like, this is who God is. At the end of the day, is super or collective self, or super ego sometimes. Everyone still with me? Thumbs up, please. 6-year-olds, okay. And I say that as a compliment, not as a. Then next will be the shadow. Oftentimes, the stories usually the antagonist. These are all of the appetites that lead to unacceptable behaviors and attitudes. Negative traits like anger, rage, revenge, lust, power. They can be internal or external, but they get in the way of the ego, where the character is, or the protagonist is, from getting to their actual destination, the collective self. And I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later, but this can either be a tyrant or an outcast, but that will make a little bit more sense later. So far we have three. We have who you are, we have what your destination is going to get to, and then we have what's causing you not to get to that. Make sense? I promise we're talking about the Pokemon stuff. And last will be an anima or animus. These will be other people in the life of the ego that are either the shadow or the self, but they can either be pushing you towards the shadow or towards the collective self. Make sense? Oftentimes in stories, this is the spouse, the love interest, sidekick, whatever the case may be, but that's what they're represented as. Those are the four major archetypes. Promise you we're still talking about Pokemon. Just bear with me. But before we talk about Pokemon, we're going to do a typical children's story. You guys are a bit younger than me, but to me, the typical kid story is the lion. I'm going to ask you, can you identify who's who? Who do you think is the ego? The ego is Scar. Who's the Simba, right? So it's the protagonist typically is the ego. It's this idea, it's the character that's trying to go somewhere. Whose story you're following is typically the ego. I have to do this. Show of hands, how many of you have seen Lion King? Okay, good, mashallah. How many of you are just not raising your hands? That's important. Okay. But okay, so just making sure this is a relevant example. But Simba, featured here for those of you who have not on the top. Okay. Yes. So that would be Simba. He is the character that you're following. I'm not your recap line. If that's the ego, who do you think is the shadow? It's pretty obvious in this case. It looks like a shadow. Scar. Because what is Scar preventing Simba from doing? That's where we get into the collective self. Who does Simba want to become? Mufasa. There's a lot of Jesus imagery also found in here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But he's trying to become Mufasa, but Scar is getting in the way of making him reach his destination. Now, remember we said there's 4 archetypes. What was that last one called? The animus, right? Or the anima. The anima and animus in this case are going to be twofold. There's ones that push towards becoming Mufasa. Who is that? Nala, right? Because when she enters into the story, she tells him, "What are you doing? You're a lion, but you're eating pathetic bugs and just doing nothing. You're supposed to bring about justice and courage and be someone who causes these things to happen." So she wakes him out of his shadow influence self and pushes him to become what? His collective self, be more like Mufasa. And then there's also Timon and Pumbaa. I know most of us think Timon and Pumbaa are the protagonists of the story. They're not, though, because what do? They tell Simba, it's okay to never reach your collective self. You can go gallivanting in this forest that doesn't eat bugs and birds and stuff all your life. You don't need to do anything else. They're actually animuses that are similar to the shadow. Because an animus can do both. It can either lead towards a shadow, your darkest self, keeping you as an ego forever, or it can be what? Push you towards becoming your collective self. You with me? I know Lion King is deep, isn't it? In this case, the shadow will actually be Scar because it's what's causing that to come out. Though I like the way you're thinking. You can make the argument that shadow is also symbolic as worse state. So that's true. Because in most stories, in most psychological spaces, you're completely right on that. But in most stories, you actually have an antagonist that represents. Does that make sense? So you're one step ahead of us. Something I'm just going to say, this is for those who want to go about this. One of the ways I love animated movies for a reason, because one of the ways that you actually start tracking, you can actually see changes in Simba. And there's a study called physiognomy, so you can read someone's face and figure out some of their qualities. The prophet Elijah sold that he had he was able to look at someone and know what they needed or what the level of development was in the moment. One of the things that they do quite well in these is you can look at the eyebrows, whether Simba has been actualized or hasn't been actualized. The key difference between Simba and Mufasa is actually the arch of the eyebrow. This is just a random skill you can pick up. This when you look at someone's face, it's actually the most distinct history of their life. Is actually that you can see in the face. One of the things that happens in Simba in the beginning of his development, or when he's like a pathetic creature just eating bugs in the forest, his eyebrows arch upward. But in that moment after Nala talks to him, his eyebrows suddenly arch the same way his father did, with his eyebrows at the edge actually being higher. You can actually see this oftentimes with people when they reach maturity. One of the signs that you'll see is actually the arch of their eyebrows change. There's a comment somewhere in there about an unfortunate reason. Sometimes we think about like, why is it so prohibited to change the way we look and all of those type of things? Well, part of it is because you're actually giving people less authentic understanding of who you are. So that's contained within your face. Unfortunately, we live in society and we try to mask that so much. So it's kind of an odd thing to just think about. Just thought of it. But now we're going to get into applying this to the law, right? If we choose an archetypal story for Quran, the biggest one I can think of is the story of Adam alayhi salam. It is the story that's going to be told over and over again up until the day of judgment. And in the story of Adam alayhi salam, let's do the exact same thing. Let's identify the 4 archetypes. First, you have who would be the ego in the story of Adam alayhi salam? Adam alayhi salam. So you have the idea of Adam alayhi salam is the ego. Who is the self? What's the ultimate destination of Adam? Adam and Jannah, or you can say Adam close to Allah. Adam is not being close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he is the collective self. Is the idea of where is he trying to get to? He wants to be close to Allah, he wants to be there forever. In the story of Adam, who is the shadow? Iblis, Shaitan. What does Shaitan do? Shaitan's whole purpose is what? Shaitan's whole purpose is to get Adam out of Jannah. And he gets him out of Jannah. I'm going to ask you even more odd question. Who's the enemies? So if Adam is to protect Allah, will be one of them. The enemies could also be all the signs that Allah has put us forward in the world that will point you back towards it. It'll be anyone who takes him away further. Someone who kills Adam. It could be the angels that give him signs. All of these will be the enemies. But that's how you actually appreciate the story. Even the story of Adam, you'll find this. You can actually do this score analysis, four-way archetype of almost any, not almost, of every single story. If we really wanted to, we could go through the story of Habib and Labib, the story of Adam and Adam, as well as the cave, the story of the calf. You can easily add these in and go through it the exact same way. But that's still not the point of why I'm making you go through all of this just yet. But it makes you appreciate that the story is what they do. One is, I look at different situations in which there's protagonists and antagonists, and how to appreciate them more. But next is, in my own life, we have to ask ourselves, do I have a collective self that I'm moving towards? And inshallah, all of us are, I guess I want to be like, it's not be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What are the shadows? Because we all have them as well. What are the people in my lives identify them as enemies? And be like, are they pushing me towards Allah? Are they pushing me towards the worst form of my own shadow? Further and further. And when you start doing that to other stories, you actually start developing the appreciation of this is the way life works. So you process yourself and it becomes more clear to you the influences in your own life. That starts taking place. So that's going to be one purpose. And the other, this is the point of today's talk as much, maybe inshallah next time we'll talk about the different approaches within the Quran. But the other thing that comes in is you start actually appreciating other people's stories as well. Because a basic person, someone who just read the Quran once, they actually should have a pretty significant education. They should be able to appreciate social inequality. Why? Because they read the story of a man who was given 2 gardens and a man who was given nothing. That they're talking to each other, and the man who's given 2 gardens is completely berating, not even like acknowledging the man who's given everything. But the guidance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala favored the man who's given nothing. And actually, it's because of his statement that he eventually gets saved. They should have that. They should be people who we should be people who appreciate that what young people in a society oftentimes feel ostracized. Don't tell me what story that's from. That's how it got. We can make the argument that we know the extraordinary circumstances of Islam, which is fine. You have a society that's trying to push people towards shirk, and because of that, they have to escape and find themselves in a shelter or something. But if we really think about that story deeply and internalize it, what does it also signify? Young people who take their faith seriously are always going to do one. They're always going to feel like the society doesn't understand. And they'll move together. You know what's even more beautiful about that? Something beautiful about that. As soon as they wake up, you know what they'll do? They'll run. MashaAllah, I see a group of young people in front of me today. And I bet you if I ask you a question or opinion on something that's very opinionated, you'd all be like, no, 2 days, no, 4 days, no, this. Like, what's the ideal vacation time? And like each of you would have a different answer because you'd argue. And you know what then one of you would say? It doesn't matter how long the perfect thing is, I want to go eat. Isn't that what happens in almost every kind of situation ever? Like, you know, young people take their needs seriously, they gather together. What are they bound to do? They're bound to get into arguments with each other. What happens next? Let's go eat. That's what Allah told the captives of the Sabbath God after they finish arguing what happens. It doesn't matter, let's gather all of our money and send so and so to go and grab food from us. Pretty relatable story. You'll have conversations about someone who had nothing, and then they were really moral, but then they were given what? A bunch of money. They figured out they had a skill, and then suddenly their morality went out the door. They became an evil person. What is that story of Paul? You'll have all of these different circumstances that start taking place that make you actually more empathetic at the end of the day. That you look at someone who's homeless, and you're not supposed to be like, they're worthless, they deserve it. Like, you know, Musadi's homeless. And that was extremely difficult for him. You can see the story of Musa, someone who has nothing. Or you can see someone who has everything, that they can still be struggling. There's stories of people who have seemingly everything. Yet internally, there's such a crazy state. That can take place as well. So again, that's a side point, but you can choose any story from Quran and really go through this process of like ego, collective self, shadow, and even in the old spiritual situation that you find yourselves. But with that, the basic education, I'm going to shout out a few of you guys tell me your stories. A mother going through pregnancy. Maryam Alayhi, right? Give me another one. A mother trying to get pregnant with cancer. Sarah, that's true. Who else? The wife of Zachariah. Who else? The mother of Maryam. Why I emphasize this one is I think this one goes often meant on notice, but there are 36 stories in the Quran. 3 of them contain either a mother or a father who's trying to have a child but cannot have a child. It's not talked about as a struggle, but that is a huge struggle, and Allah emphasizes that story. It makes us live it as we go through the Quran to say there are people who are going through this, and it's difficult for them, and oftentimes what do they get out of it? You get a closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a response from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that it's very difficult for others to really appreciate or understand. So if you see people going through that, appreciate it. A child feeling alone. Yusuf is a great example. And isn't it interesting? Is it a child from a not well-off family? No, it's a child from what? It's a child from a prophetic family. With is it a child that has no one to talk to or pray with? No, this is a child that has, so from the outside, is supposed to have the best social upbringing ever. He's got 12 older brothers. But what? Feeling alone the whole time through. Who's feeling estranged from their parents or the society? You already talked about this, is how we have parents who are unhappy with their children. Why I want this one to sink in is what sometimes happens. Communities, they look at someone having difficulty with their child, and you know what they say? Must have come from somewhere. Parents must have done something wrong. Someone who's been educated by the Quran, you know what they're supposed to do? They love them because law fits this child. Was anyone going to say that Nuh was a bad father? Another example, Yaqub alayhi salam. He is put forward as a perfect father in the world. But he's got, if you want to talk about children having problems, 12 of them ganged up and might have killed one of them. That is a major problem. But you're supposed to look at it, it's not his fault. It's the child of Allah. As you read it, again, it solidifies for you your own personal life, even to life different. But continuing through. Rich people talk to poor people, everyone should have sounded at the day. You can have even Sulaiman Naisan talking to the people who come up to him with the problem. Knowledgeable people talking to ignorant people. That's an odd word for me to label that, because no one would ever say Musai sounds ignorant. But it's this idea that knowledge doesn't come to the same, at all as the same form. Because what happens to humans sometimes? What happens to us? We get deluded. We think what we have is all we need. But sometimes a prophet gets educated by another prophet. That can happen. We'll go through we'll just go to those powerful people talking to homeless people. Fir'aun and Musa, right? Fir'aun, most powerful person. But guess what? Musa alayhi salam, who's the actual noble one of the eyes of Allah? Musa alayhi salam. A wife with an abusive husband. Asya and Fir'aun. You have, and this is the other thing. You see someone suffering, it's not like they made a wrong choice or something. Like, no, you actually give out empathy. Why? She's in a terrible situation, but we don't judge her because of her husband. That's partly what the Quran is also supposed to be teaching. That when you see someone's spouse who's bad, does that mean that they're bad? No, if anything, they might be people who are first after Jannah, as we have with Asya. A husband with an abusive wife. Dudes. You have a prophet who's calling people towards Islam, calling them away from indecency, and all of these things, and his wife is doing what? He's leaking information of the home to random people who are antagonistic against Muslims. Feeling powerless, consider every prophet ever, basically in this scenario. Sibling rivalry. Most obviously, the use of siblings. So again, the Quran, someone who's read through all the stories of the Quran, what is it supposed to do? It's supposed to give you a deep appreciation of these are all of these human conditions that people can find themselves in. So that while I become less judgmental and I actually empathetically experience what people are going through, so that when I see it, I don't immediately judge. I actually have a more nuanced approach to it. Does that make sense? Following me still? Now I'm going to get into, I said I would pick this up, but shadows are of two types. Because so far what we've been talking about is, okay, so when I see a situation, I know kind of how to deal with it. That's what the story can kind of teach. When we think about antagonists in the Quran, there are two basic types of antagonists. There are tyrants, and then there are outcasts. Okay. I'll first give you the definition, and I want you guys to work up to really appreciating what that definition means. A tyrant is someone who is a result of a completely corrupt system. A system is really bad, there's a bunch of terrible policies. The tyrant is just the representative of the worst of all of those things. And in an outcast, there's a perfectly working system, a perfect society, but the outcast corrupts anyone that they touch. The system isn't messed up, the outcast is messed up. Make sense? Oh, this is supposed to be a bullet points that came in. Oh, I know why. This is slides. This is the PowerPoint. Okay, so the two archetypal antagonists of the Quran are Shaitan and Fir'aun. Shaitan is the ultimate, he's not a rajim, the ultimate outcast. And Fir'aun is the ultimate tyrant. Don't call him the place. I said all the time that Caesar was a bit of a tyrant or anyway. That's not where my namesake comes from. But Pharaoh was what? This representative, everything was wrong with the system already. Pharaoh is just the biggest representative of that. Versus Shaitan, he lives in heavenly order. Let's get some more examples. But he lives in heavenly order, but he's trying to corrupt the system. In common literature, you'll actually see this taking place. The Scar we already talked about, right, from the Lion King. You have a perfect system. Mufasa has this kingdom and things are working fine in it. And if things went as they were supposed to, what's supposed to happen? Mufasa's training Simba, and Simba's going to take over and be an awesome king. But what happens? Scar gets in the way and causes everything to be derailed. Scar is an outcast. Maleficent, you have the same thing going on with Sleeping Beauty. She's supposed to take over the kingdom afterward, but because she takes over, or she stops that from happening, kingdom goes into disarray. I don't know what the octopus lady's name is. Anyone? Ursula. Okay. Same thing. It's the idea of like an outcast, and I know Loki. I don't be able to get this together. But it's this idea that you see this in stories quite frequently, and I'll tell you why I'm referring to popular culture in this a second. But you'll see this in stories that happens. What's the type of shadow it can be? Sometimes it's an outcast. If it's a perfect system, all you need to do is what? Just return back to that system and we'll be fine. Is Adamism given any new thing to do? What is it? You already know what to do. Go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we think we'll be fine. What is the problem? He caused you to disobey Allah. It's a simple solution, it's a simple fix. That's what an outcast is. That's one type of antagonist. And then there's the other type of antagonist, which is the tyrant. A tyrant, well, I should probably leave what else I wrote. Well, you guys know this. A A tyrant is someone who is representative of all the negatives in a society. So you have a couple of people representing like General Zod from Superman. He's everything wrong with all the old Krypton is him all put in one. Jafar, you have the same thing. The kingdom is dysfunctional because it's run by idiots. Sorry, but it's run by an idiot. It has lots of problems with it. Jafar is just the epitome of all of them. Vader, the same thing. The brokenness of everything that was going on in the Galactic Senate. Vader is representative of it. That's where that comes from. Azula, the same thing. Everything wrong with all of the stuff going on in Avatar world and Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, I believe. But again, they exploit power. They exist in an unethical world, and they live within normal societal structures. The villain symbolizes the evil that's already there. The one that can stand up to them will be the outcasts. And here's something interesting about this. This villain, what it tends to do is try to remove education. That's a lot like Pharaoh. Don't get the money, it's not educated. Wants everyone to be the same. Anyone who steps out of line, we immediately say no. You can't think differently. And they, well, the actual solution is not to return to the system that bore them, it's actually to change the entire system. This will be like Pharaoh. That's why when Musaisan comes up to Pharaoh, the solution isn't to replace Pharaoh. Did the Quran ever say kill Pharaoh? Couldn't that have been the dua of Musaisan? Yeah, Allah kill Pharaoh. Do all the prophets accepted it? Story end. But why would that not work? The whole system is corrupt. So what? If you kill Pharaoh, what's going to happen? Another Pharaoh is just going to take over. So what does Allah cause them to do? Move yourselves from Egypt. Completely. Get yourselves lost in the desert because you have so many tendencies of problems still, generation after generation after generation is going to take place for you guys to finally get your own kingdom without slavery. That's going to happen much later because you have to remove all the effects of the time. Versus when Shaitan affected Adam, how long did it take for Adam to get back into the basis of Allah? An instant. That's okay. An instant. Then what happened? Just remove the negative and it'll be fine. Why I bring this up is one is first and foremost what's the protagonist role. The Quran wants us to take deeply the idea of storytelling. Not all antagonists are the same. Allah doesn't present them all as the same. You actually appreciate that not all problems get fixed the same way. The protagonist role of the outcast, they have to accept their own responsibility. Why? The problem was with me. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. So oftentimes the hero is the chosen one. They need to accept social responsibility, and they are a reformer. They change things back to how they used to be, and things are fine. Al-Islam obeys Allah again, he earns Jannah. Allah sent words to Adam, and with it, Adam returned back to Allah. Versus when there's a tyrant, the main character, the protagonist, has to actually accept the individuality. That, if anything, the other one, they have to return back to what they used to be. The hero, the protagonist, is the outcast and needs to stand up for what makes them different. They don't need to conform. The hero and the other one need to conform, accept who you were meant to be. This one, you need to actually change and not be what everyone else is becoming. They need to break or rethink the social order, and they are the rebel of the outcast. So one other way of justifying or putting it all together is a just world with an unjust villain, or an unjust world with a just villain. That's ways to kind of summarize what I just said here. And here's where I'll say why I keep referencing popular culture here is I'm not saying that we're going to make the Quran relevant by giving all of these examples. That's not my role in doing this. It's actually any story that has stood the test of time and is significant to people. It's actually because it's helping people understand these archetypes. They are doing the work oftentimes that actually stories of the Quran do as well. But the Quran does it in the best way. That's what we'll figure out more next week when we got to make more examples. But here I say the types of protagonists that exist. There's actually 3 types. If we're looking at Marvel or PC superhero movies are all the rage right now, right? When we're talking about breaking records and everything. But you think Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor, or if we're going on the DC side, it's Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And where I want you to think about this is the types of protagonists. There's only three types of protagonists that really exist. There's the unchanging protagonist. Think about any story you've ever heard. The hero was good, has always been good, and because of their goodness, the society comes back. That's the unchanging protagonist. That's Captain America. Literally, what happens in his story? He gets thrown in ice for 70 years. He was good then, and he's good when he comes out. So what? Society needs to always just return back to him. Then there's sometimes it's called the self-building protagonist, which is what? This protagonist realizes something and they move ahead of society, and society has to catch up with them. That's like Iron Man, develops a new sense of morality, technology, whatever the case may be, everyone has to catch up with him. And the last one will be the redemptive hero. This idea that he used to be on good, he fell off, and then he can return to being good. And as he does, and he goes through that, everyone else benefits as well. Think of every Thor movie. What happens in the beginning of the movie? He loses his hammer or his powers or goes on a different planet, whatever the case may be. Think about what happens at the end of it. He has a bigger hammer, or he gets back his hammer, whatever the case may be. Same thing happens in every Wonder Woman movie. I don't have to be watching them. That happens as well. Versus in certain Iron Man or Batman, the same thing. He goes on a mountain and learns a bunch of skills to do what? Because now he can be without the needs to be. Versus Superman, it's the unchanging, which is what? He's just born better. Everyone else has to be like him. It's an unchanging hero story. Think about the Ibrahim alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, and Musa alayhi salam. Think about all of their stories, what happens. Ibrahim alayhi salam recognizes what? I know the cause of all of our problems. Shirk. Worship. But Isa alayhi salam. You guys are all practicing religion, but like you're focusing on complete wrong stuff. Musa alayhi salam. Complete reform needs to take place. You recognize what? I've been living a lifestyle that is, he was living in the palace. And suddenly what happens? He gets an awakening and he develops himself. Allah puts him through a Tarbiyah program. Then he takes that with money of Sahih and challenges and fixes society as a result. The other, so think about the ahead type of groups that will happen. Ibrahim alayhi salam, we already talked about Salih, Musa, unchanging. Isa alayhi salam, another way you look at his own story is, Isa alayhi salam has to return the Bani Israel to what? To actually what Islam is about, not what you guys have turned it into. Lut, Salih, Hud, or the rebirth stories. Adam alayhi salam. I said I have Musa in every single category because it depends on which part of the story you focus on. Musa alayhi salam, again, a rebirth story. He was in a palace, he has to be a leader of the people again. Yunus alayhi salam is probably the most archetypal rebirth story. He was calling people to Allah. He decides not to. He goes to his lowest point, and then what? Once Allah asks Allah forgiveness, says, I will call them back. The entire society actually accepts it as a result. For Yusuf is a great example of this rebirth story. He goes through a struggle from one area of power to no power, and then back to power, and the entire society benefits as a result. Why I'm doing this is, like I said before, I'm not giving you these examples to be like, just watch a bunch of Marvel movies and DC movies and you'll be fine, you'll have guidance. That's not what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to say is more along the lines of the stories of the Quran their actual purpose was to make people aware of these things for themselves. And the way Allah does that is the most nuanced and best way. Why certain pieces of literature tend to withstand the test of time. Why Spider-Man needs to be made every 7 years. Why these things constantly keep happening is because they actually contain with them some of those same archetypes. And when you really think about it, there's like 7 stories that are told. There's rags to riches, there's a coming of age story, there's a romance, there's only a few stories that you can be told why. Because as you tell that story, people feel like I'm more fully versed than myself. But why I'm telling you this is more not to say just keep watching those. They're actually pointing towards what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals. And my purpose of doing that is the next time you watch The Mandalorian or Star Wars or these 7 things, It's not to be like, I can do this instead of the Quran. That actually comes toward the Quran tells these lessons in actually a better way, more pure. And hopefully it's a mechanism the other way. Does that make sense? Now with that, back to the Quran. Couple of questions to answer as we're wrapping up. Why is it important to have both heroes and villains? Well, the Quran doesn't just talk about the story of heroes. You know what's interesting? I was studying actually the story of Musa with a rabbi. And he said, he made a comment that was very interesting. And he said, your book talks about the psychological states of even the minor characters. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, nothing is said about the mother of Moses in the Torah. Because when I was telling about the story of Musa, I sort of process. I understand to talk about the heart of the mother of Musa, how her heart became cool, her eyes became cool after seeing him again. He's like, there's a lot of emphasis on her emotional state, but the Quran completely skipped out whose house she ended up in, what path he took, all of those things. It skipped out on her completely, but it really focused on that. Your Quran talks about Pharaoh was afraid. Pharaoh was afraid. That's what Allah talks about. Pharaoh was afraid because of the people that would overthrow him. He goes like, the emotional state of Pharaoh is being talked about. Yeah, the Quran talks about what heroes and villains because part of our approach with these stories is they both are related to not the focus of today, but there's actually a very interesting line that Musa tells the Bani Israel, and the moment the opinion that I hold to most is the Musa has taken the Bani Israel outside of Egypt. They're all marching towards the Red Sea. And in front of them, they see the sea. And behind them, they look at Pharaoh's army. And Pharaoh's army is coming. And this time, they're not coming to enslave them, they're coming to kill them. And the people turn to Musa and they say, before you came, we were in difficulty. After you're here, we're still in difficulty. Nothing has changed. If anything, it seems like things are worse. They don't say that. They just say nothing has changed. And Musa turns around to them and says, maybe it could be that Allah destroys Pharaoh and gives you dominion, and then we'd see how well you would do. Musa basically telling them, you're in a test, you are. You know who else is in a test? Pharaoh has been in a test this entire time. You have an opportunity to pass it, don't fail it. So why heroes and villains? On talks about villains as well. To empower both. And it's not just a society of rules, because sometimes one of the stories is about the society needs to be reformed, the rules didn't work, so they need to be updated. And other times, the rules are fine, you need to return back to them. But the Quran never leads to a society that thinks that rules have no place. So you appreciate both types of stories. Both can be sources of good and evil, and an individual can be the problem, or the society can be the problem. It's for us to become much more aware of these things. That's the idea of the Quran and the stories of the Quran, what they lead towards. The Quran came to fix the individual. People need to change in order to return to the good structure of the law, and the other way around. The Quran came to fix society. That laws and structure need to change to better serve the good. Both can exist. And if we really wanted to look at each of these stories, I'm really running out of time to rush through this. But if we do an analysis of the stories, some of the stories, Adam alayhi salam, what is it? It's a return to heavenly order of responsibilities. Is this something to change? No. Shaitan's an outcast, immediately get back. Nuh alayhi salam, what's the only solution? Society needs to change. Over so much time, all of the actual institutions of society have corrupted themselves. Or what is Allah's subhanahu wa ta'ala solution? A society needs to be replaced. Yunus alayhi salam, he needs to accept responsibility. So that what? Because Allah gave him a command, he needs to follow through on that command. It's not individual. Musa alayhi salam, society needs to change. Harun alayhi salam, it's not an interesting one. The people in power need to change. It's a microcosm of the bigger. That needs to change. Because when they start worshiping a golden calf. And we'll end here, but next week what my plan was is actually look at another archetypal trope that's found in literature and all of these places and see the Quran's actually on this. For those of you who, this is a great book I recommend. It's talking about women and gender in the Quran. I highly recommend it. But what I was planning on doing is talking about the tropes of women in the Quran and how that oftentimes doesn't get mentioned appropriately, why that creates an unhealthy society. And on the other hand, talk about like what is an appropriate form of female empowerment in the Quran that's a balanced approach. And we'll particularly be focusing on the wife of the mother of Musa, the wife of Musa, and the sister of Musa. Because one of the things that's really cool about the Quran is when we look at the stories of the Quran, we'll oftentimes have parallels. You know, two stories that are told that have so many similarities, but the distinct differences make them really quite amazing. And one I'll talk about is the story of Yusuf are foils of Egypt. Yusuf's story in the Quran, not talking about the biblical one. Do we know anything about his mom? Anything about his sisters? Anything about his wife? Nothing, right? Story of Musa, do we know anything about his father? No. The story of Musa, at least the first half of it, all you have is a bunch of women. Mother of Musa, foster mother of Musa, sister of Musa. That's what it is. It's the complete foil of the story of Yusuf, which is the complete opposite kind of foil. Why would that be done? Also, if I contrast the story a little bit more, think about also stories and how they're told to a person. There are certain people, let's just say you get to know someone, that they tell you, does anyone almost ever tell you their story from, I was born on this day, and this is where I am now? No one tells you. Or it might happen, but it happens very occasionally. That's the story of Yusuf, for example. Most of us says what? Yusuf, for example, the entire story of Suhba. But what usually happens is when you get to know someone, you find out a random detail about their last week, and then they share a story about their childhood, and then they share a story about a very difficult time that they had, and then they share a story about this. Isn't that what that's how the story of Musa is now? It's in pieces. That's how we experience stories as we hear them. As you go through these stories little by little, it also makes you more aware of how different stories will be told to you along levels. Makes sense? So next week, inshallah, that's the plan. We'll study not just completely look at an example of the actual story of the Quran and try to take some tropes from it, and how oftentimes it circumvents our typical tropes that we see all around us, and how the Quran in its storytelling is actually a corrected perspective rather than just being like one that entertains or one that gives you the same things that we used to. Oftentimes it corrects your perspective on what you need to form your analysis. I went all the way towards the end, and there's a conversation, discussion afterward. Anyone have any quick questions that we could move on? If necessary, okay. I see 2 hands. So the chapter. I think that's a deeper point. I think that's something very powerful. In our tradition, almost anyone that makes a mistake blames eventually on, and it's very well done because humanity is always capable of reform in some way. And that's why there is a minority opinion where it talks about that even Shada'am at the end does what? He tries to say, I believe in the Lord of himself. The majority opinion is, of course, he dies. So there is an opinion that says, well, no, he might have actually been redeemed at the very end. But I would say it gives that so that if you fall into that state, you even see even the pure villains of the Quran had moments of like origin, what they were afraid of, why they were doing what they were doing. If I find those tendencies, I now have the ability of correcting them. So that's where it would be. So even if there's comparisons, it's still to be to call you back. It's the actual goal, not to say, you look like this. So that's how you're do the same thing. Does that make sense? I can see it. I can see it. Yes. Allah will end with this, and that is that the stories of the prophets were found in previous revelations. They were, but this is why the Quran, one of its goals is to correct those stories, because either people purposefully removed certain things so the Quran helps to correct the narrative, or they didn't pay attention to the right things and the guidance was removed from it. That's why our approach to books of the past is if it agrees with what Allah has revealed later on, then we say there's good in it, but if it disagrees with it, we say it's either been changed or the guidance has been taken away from the people. Does that make sense? So it very well could be that they used to actually talk about these things, but the people said, now we don't care about these things. We want to know. We want to know what year it was. We want to talk about it in the later past. They want to know these type of things. So it was the guidance seems to be approved from it on the inserts of the actual model. That makes sense? And so with that, we're going to go ahead and we can continue this conversation. I'll be around for 2 minutes after lunch for those that want to continue. But we're great for Robert. Next time we're together will be in 2 weeks. Yeah. Yes, it will be in 2 weeks. We're going to specifically be taking a deep dive into excerpts in this book. But we'll be continuing our conversation of storytelling in the Quran. We'll be taking 2 examples of how we can do storytelling better and appreciate stories more of the Quran by diving into 2 examples. Is that fair? What else is the incentive?